One fungus erased Sri Lanka's entire coffee empire in the 1800s. That same organism is now active across 6 continents. Coffee is a $100 billion industry, and it depends on 26 million smallholders keeping their trees alive. The hard truth is that many cannot afford to fight coffee leaf rust without going broke. This matters far beyond coffee-growing regions. More than 100 million people rely on this chain for income and work. When disease pressure and price pressure hit together, supply, migration, and food security move with them. In this episode, we will map why rust keeps winning and what actually changes outcomes. Roughly $100 billion moves through global coffee each year. Producing countries across Latin America, Africa, and Asia capture about $39 billion of that value. Most coffee is still grown by smallholders on plots of 5 hectares or less, so global exposure sits on very thin farm-level buffers. The retail side captures much more value than origin producers. U.S. retail coffee alone reached about $87 billion. That spread between farm gate and final cup is one of the largest in agriculture. It leaves growers exposed when biology turns against them. The pathogen is Himalaya vastatrix, the fungus behind coffee leaf rust. It first appears as orange, powdery lesions under the leaf surface. Those lesions drain nutrients and reduce photosynthesis capacity. The tree loses energy before farmers see full canopy damage. Then, the second hit arrives. Infected trees defoliate early and lose the leaf area needed for future growth. That means one outbreak cuts current cherries and weakens next season's branch development. Severe infections reduce yield by about 35 to 75% and can end in tree death. Ceylon showed the full pattern in 1869. At peak, the island exported more than 100 million pounds of coffee each year. New rail links and dense monoculture gave rust ideal transmission conditions. Within decades, coffee disappeared, and tea took its place. That event was not a historical curiosity. It reset global supply geography toward the Americas for generations. It also proved that disease plus concentration can erase a national crop system. The basic mechanics have not changed. Now move to Colombia from 2008 to 2011. Climatic anomalies hit at the same time trees were aging across key regions. Fertilizer prices spiked after the global financial crisis, and smallholders cut inputs because they could not finance full management. The production loss was sharp. National output fell about 31% relative to the 2007 baseline. Economically stressed farms reduced nutrition and care, so trees became biologically weaker. Epidemiological evidence later confirmed that lower investment accelerates pathogen spread. Central America entered a harsher phase in the 2011 to 2012 season. By 2012, rust had infected around 70% of farms across the corridor. At the same time, coffee prices slid to about $1.01 per pound by late 2013. Farmers growing Typica and bourbon had almost no financial room to respond. That combination stripped protection from whole landscapes. Many producers could not buy fungicides, fertilizers, or pruning labor. Unmanaged trees became transmission reservoirs for neighboring farms. Biology followed liquidity. The first-year damage was massive. Regional production dropped by about 2.7 million bags in 1 year. Immediate economic losses were estimated near $500 million. In only one cycle, a plant disease became a macroeconomic shock. The longer wave was worse. Over 5 years, the regional toll reached roughly $3.2 billion. About 1.7 million coffee workers were displaced. Rural labor systems unraveled as farms reduced activity or shut down. Country-level losses were severe and uneven. El Salvador lost about 70% of production between 2010 and 2014. Honduras dropped around 23%, and Guatemala fell about 18%. Even relatively strong regions could not fully contain spread under financing stress. At Finca El Valle in Guatemala, the collapse was dramatic. Output fell from around 140,000 pounds to about 28,000 pounds. Roughly an 80% yield crash on a well-known specialty estate. If a flagship farm can fail that hard, smaller farms face worse odds. Some areas of the Central American dry corridor reached crisis IPC Phase 3 food insecurity. Families responded through rapid urban migration and cross-border movement. The labor shock fed back into farm recovery capacity. Disease became a social system event. Hawaii then confirmed the spread risk in a high-value origin. Rust was detected in October 2020 and spread across Maui, Hawaii Island, Oahu, and Lanai. Sequencing showed the Hawaiian strain matched a multi-locus genotype seen in Central America. This was not an isolated legacy strain. Researchers link that genotype to 222 specimens from El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Puerto Rico. Hawaii's coffee economy contributes roughly $500 million in local activity. Early containment gaps allowed incidence to rise to about 43 to 77% by late 2021. Once established, control costs rose fast. USDA projections show continued pressure there. Utilized production for 2025/2026 is forecast near 17.8 million pounds, about 20% below the previous season. Bearing acreage is also down by about 500 acres. Brazil faced a different stress profile in 2024. Extreme drought and heat waves hit major producing zones. Robusta growers in Espírito Santo and Bahia used broad pruning and stumping to keep orchards alive. Survival management replaced productivity management. Arabica exposure remained high. Much acreage stayed in susceptible cultivars, such as Catuai and Mundo Novo. That forced repeated chemical protection windows from December through April. Climatic stress made those schedules harder and more expensive. Vietnam showed a different paradox. From October 2024 to January 2025, export volume fell about 38.2%. Part came from shortages, and part came from producer hoarding while waiting for better prices. Volume shrank even as price expectations rose. Yet revenue moved the other way. Export earnings in January 2025 were nearly $695 million, up about 8.8%. Rising Robusta futures on the London market offset lower tonnage. Volume weakness and revenue growth coexisted. Uganda's data highlights chronic burden. Productivity per hectare fell by nearly 50%, from about 855 kilograms to around 432. Coffee wilt also intensified, with incidence rising from 30% to 42% over recent decades. Similar signals in Kenya and Ethiopia point to climate-enabled expansion. This is where the story changes. Coffee leaf rust is not only a biological problem. It behaves like a financial disease with biological symptoms. Capital access determines whether epidemiology accelerates or slows. Colombian epidemiological economic models made this explicit. Researchers combined botanical modeling with machine learning tools such as TPOT and weather forecasting via SARIMA. They simulated pandemic intervention policies covering chemical and cultural controls. The result was brutally clear under both controlled and real conditions. Without external support, smallholders cannot sustain profitability through an outbreak. Even with perfect real-time farm data and accurate forecasts, the maximum modeled return was about a 4% profit margin on investment. That is the best-case ceiling, not a typical outcome. Field reality usually performs worse. Under realistic sampling constraints, outcomes turn negative. Farmers inspect only a fraction of trees in time-sensitive windows. Labor, chemical inputs, and fixed operations costs can exceed the harvest value preserved. Control effort then becomes a net loss decision. Price cycles are the main transmission channel. When prices crash, farm liquidity disappears first. Nutrition, pruning, and prevention are delayed, and tree immunity drops. The pathogen expands into that gap. Market structure amplifies this pressure. 5 roasting groups, including Nestle and JDE Peets, control about 55 to 60% of roasted and soluble volume globally. That concentration creates oligopsony pressure at the farm gate. Smallholders absorb the bargaining imbalance. Even record futures in 2024 and 2025 did not solve the trap. Arabica traded above $4.40 per pound, and Robusta approached $5,700 per ton. But financing stress upstream was severe. Working capital friction overrode headline prices. Roasters facing a $2.5 trillion trade finance gap began stretching payment terms. Delays of 60, 90, and 120 days spread through contracts. Liquidity moved out of the producer end of the chain. Cash timing became the binding constraint. Those delays cascaded from roaster to importer to exporter to cooperative. Cooperatives that rely on fast turnover could not pay growers at delivery. Farmers needing immediate cash turned to side selling at lower prices. Contract discipline weakened as survival choices took over. Producer share remained extremely low. Farmers captured about 1% of final retail value. On a $4 cup, that is roughly 4 cents back to origin. Risk stayed with growers while margin stayed elsewhere. Forward contracts added another failure mode. When spot prices moved above fixed terms, defaults increased. Trade behavior studies found that about half of observed defaults were strategic. In those cases, coffee existed, but contracts were intentionally broken for better spot sales. Lenders responded with tighter credit rationing. That defensive behavior protected lenders and reduced farm working capital. Modeling attributes about 15.8% average sector output loss to chronic underfinancing from this channel. Financial caution became productive loss. Recovery outcomes split along one axis. Countries that invested before the peak shock recovered faster. Countries that delayed investment remained exposed longer. Timing of public capital changed epidemiological trajectories. Honduras moved early with a subsidized replanting program in 2008. It promoted resistant materials, including paranema, before the regional wave peaked. When the epidemic arrived, older, non-renovated blocks took most damage. Prior investment created a protective buffer. National production dipped to about 4.5 million bags, then recovered. By 2014/2015, Honduras reached an unprecedented 6 million bags. The 2025/2026 forecast stands near 5.80 million bags, measured in 60-kilogram units. Rust incidence is now about 2.9%. Colombia executed the most aggressive renovation strategy. The National Federation of Coffee Growers and Senicafe scaled resistant coverage from 35% in 2010 to 87% by 2026. National rust prevalence now sits around 5.7%. Annual avoided costs are estimated near $200 million. Long-run control depends on genetics. World Coffee Research launched the Innovia Global Coffee Breeding Network to accelerate cultivar development timelines. By late 2025, the network covered 11 countries, representing about 40% of coffee exports. Ghana and Vietnam joined Robusta breeding efforts within that platform. Breeding throughput is expanding, but still constrained by biology. Partners distributed about 5,000 genetically unique plants in 2023. The target is unrestricted commercial release of resistant, climate-adapted varieties by 2033. That timeline is ambitious, but not immediate. Pathogen diversity remains the hardest obstacle. More than 55 races of Hemilia vastatrix have been documented. Different races can defeat different host resistance genes, so one silver bullet variety is unlikely. The largest coordinated Arabica evaluation confirms this. Trials covered 29 varieties across 23 sites in 15 countries. No single variety showed universal immunity across environments. Pure Arabica lines repeatedly failed under pressure. That evidence points to one viable path. Breeding must use Robusta gene introgression via interspecific hybrids. This is technically feasible, but slow and capital-intensive. It also requires long-term distribution systems that reach smallholders. Genetics without financing does not scale. Replanting cost is the next barrier. Nearly 40% of global coffee area contains aging, susceptible trees. Renovation costs range from about $3,000 to $5,000 per hectare across much of Latin America. In Nicaragua, costs can reach about $7,000 per hectare. Global capital requirements are therefore large. Estimates suggest around $5.7 billion is needed in year zero just to start. Across 25 years, the requirement rises to about $28.6 billion. Most smallholders cannot pre-fund that transition. Then comes the income gap period. A replanted plot produces no coffee for roughly 2 to 4 years. Economists call this the valley of death. Without structured finance, subsistence growers cannot survive that gap. Technology can reduce some risk while breeding catches up. In Tanzania, mobile-based detection models reached about 99% accuracy in field trials using DenseNet 201+. Better detection improves response timing at lower cost. It cannot replace resistant genetics, but it can buy time. Financial innovation also helps at the margin. Vietnam's coffee climate protection insurance uses satellite triggers tied to rainfall thresholds. Payments are automatic when conditions breach preset limits. Faster payouts protect liquidity in critical windows. Program design matters too. Central America's Asombrate program, led by Solidaridad with Microsoft, enrolled about 30,000 smallholders. It planted more than 700,000 agroforestry trees and removed about 36,000 tons of carbon dioxide. It also transferred roughly 2.6 billion Colombian pesos to farmers via carbon credits. Funding pipelines are expanding, but still fragmented. A $6 million USDA Specialty Crop Research Initiative grant supports virulence gene mapping at Purdue. A separate $1.37 million award funds breeding work at the Hawaii Agriculture Research Center. Public research and development is moving, but scale remains uneven. Multilateral and platform finance is growing in parallel. The World Bank identified about $2.5 billion in green finance potential for Ethiopia's coffee sector. The Global Coffee Platform committed €2 million through SASI for about 18,000 farmers in Kenya and Uganda. These are meaningful pilots, not yet system-level coverage. Standards governance is also tightening. At the Third African Coffee Week in Addis Ababa in February 2026, the African Organization for Standardization launched the African Standard for Sustainable Coffee. It aligns export protocols with the EU deforestation regulation and broader ESG frameworks. The goal is compliance without excluding vulnerable producers. But core structural fractures remain. Living income gaps across major origins still run from about 30 to 85%. Many households service high-interest debt before cherries are harvested, so even good seasons can leave net vulnerability. EUDR compliance introduces another risk. It requires precise geolocation for each export lot. Large traders can finance mapping and keep control of compliance records. Smallholders can lose bargaining power if they do not own their own data. Import behavior is already shifting. Risk-averse European buyers show signs of reducing purchases from forest-adjacent smallholders in Africa and Central America. Sourcing is moving toward larger, easily verified estates in Brazil. Compliance can therefore reallocate market access, not just enforce standards. This is the rust paradox. The supply chain concentrates value at the top and concentrates risk at the bottom. Ecological and financial exposure sits with producers least able to absorb shocks. When pressure rises, collapse and partial recovery repeat. What keeps the cycle alive is not mystery, it is architecture. Prices are discovered globally, but protection costs are paid locally by households with almost no slack. Buyers can diversify sourcing, while farmers cannot diversify climate or disease exposure at the same speed. The result is recurring fragility that looks natural but is financially engineered. In practice, each layer pushes risk downward. Roasters protect working capital, traders protect compliance, lenders protect repayment, and insurers protect exclusions. None of those actions is irrational in isolation. Together, they leave the producer as the shock absorber of last resort. That is why biological advice alone cannot solve this. Better pruning, smarter spraying, and improved forecasting matter, but they fail without liquidity at the right time. Farmers need pre-crisis finance, not post-crisis sympathy. Otherwise, every outbreak turns into forced sales, debt rollover, and the next outbreak. If the industry wants stability, it has to pay for resilience where risk is actually carried. That means invest before infection peaks, reward verified prevention, and keep compliance power from becoming buyer lock-in. Without that shift, rust will keep returning as a predictable financial event. And each cycle will keep proving the same point. The fungus is visible, But the real pathogen is structural imbalance.